What if we told you that one of the most tense interviews in journalism history just happened, and the entire world is talking about the devastating response that silenced a reporter live on air? The moment when Mel Gibson, known for his brutal honesty and courage to face any opposition, left an entire room speechless didn't happen in a courtroom or at a Hollywood awards ceremony. It happened during an interview that should have been routine, but transformed into the type of confrontation that defines careers and exposes uncomfortable truths that few dare to speak. What happened in that studio wasn't just an exchange of words. It was a devastating demonstration of how a man who has already lost everything for his convictions can use that freedom to say exactly what needs to be said, regardless of the consequences. Mel Gibson wasn't there to make friends or protect reputations. He was there to speak a truth that many know, but few have the courage to verbalize publicly. The tension was evident from the moment he entered the studio. The reporter, clearly confident in his ability to destabilize the actor and director through provocative questions, didn't expect to encounter someone who had spent decades being attacked by the media and had learned not just to survive, but to thrive in the midst of controversy. What followed was a masterclass in how experience transforms an ordinary man into an unstoppable force. When the journalist tried to use the usual tactics of shame and emotional manipulation, Mel Gibson responded with a calm that completely disarmed the strategy. His words weren't shouted or loaded with defensive anger. Instead, they were delivered with the surgical precision of someone who intimately knows the power of words and the exact moment to use them for maximum impact. If you seek to understand the divine mysteries that happen around us, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share in the comments your own spiritual experiences that may connect with what you're about to discover. The context of this extraordinary interview goes back to early 2025, when Mel Gibson agreed to participate in Joe Rogan's podcast, a platform known for its long, unfiltered conversations. What should have been a discussion about his cinematographic projects quickly transformed into something much deeper and more controversial. Gibson, who had just lost his Malibu home in California's devastating fires, was in a complex emotional state, mixing the pain of material loss with a renewed spiritual clarity about what really matters in life. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Gibson began talking about his discoveries related to alternative cancer treatments, mentioning that 3 of his friends had completely recovered from stage 4 cancer through unconventional methods. His words about ivermectin and fenbendazole caused shockwaves in the official medical community, which quickly mobilized to debunk his claims and label them as dangerous and irresponsible. But it was during a later interview, when a journalist tried to confront him about these statements, that the moment happened that's circulating in millions of views on social media. The reporter, clearly trying to discredit Gibson and force him to retract, asked a question loaded with insinuations about his responsibility in sharing unofficial medical information with such a vast audience. Gibson's response was devastating in its simplicity. When 3 men I love were dying and doctors said there was nothing more to be done, they tried something different, and today they're alive. If this bothers people who profit from death, then I accept being bothered by them. The silence that followed in the studio lasted almost 10 seconds, an eternity in the television world, while the journalist clearly processed the devastating implication of the response. Sometimes we wonder what exists beyond our physical world, and other times strange things happen that make us question everything we think about life. In situations like these, better understanding can mean the difference between staying confused and having clarity. That's exactly what our ebook, The Secret of Jesus' Apparitions, offers. Consider acquiring this incredible material for a symbolic value. This exclusive material offers keys to decipher divine signs and understand how Christ manifests in our days. Your contribution allows us to maintain this independent research work. The link to acquire the material is available in the pinned comment. The moment became even more powerful when Gibson continued, without giving the reporter a chance to recover. "You want me to shut up about things I saw work because they don't have the seal of approval from the same institutions that failed these people? You want me to prioritize politics over human lives? Then you misunderstood who I am and what drives me." The immediate reaction of the audience present in the studio was spontaneous applause, something extremely rare in journalistic interviews. Even more significant was the fact that the journalist, visibly shaken by the response, tried to quickly change the subject, but Gibson didn't allow it. "No, let's finish this thought," he said, taking complete control of the conversation. "Because that's what always happens. You ask a question about life and death, and when you get an honest answer, you flee to another topic. That's not journalism. That's cowardice." The exchange exposed not only the hypocrisy of the media system that attacks messengers instead of investigating messages, but also revealed the personal transformation that Gibson had undergone after decades of public persecution. This was no longer the man who lost control under pressure. This was someone who had found a source of strength deeper than public approval or professional success. What happened in the days following that devastating interview was even more revealing than the confrontation itself. Mel Gibson hadn't just silenced a journalist live, he had exposed an entire system of narrative control that operates through fear and intimidation. The reaction from medical institutions, social media, and traditional media was so coordinated and fierce that it only confirmed everything Gibson had suggested about the financial interests behind information suppression. The most disturbing aspect of the official reaction was the speed and coordination with which it happened, as if there was a pre-established protocol for dealing with exactly this type of situation. Gibson, in a follow-up interview a few days later, commented on this. "It's fascinating how they can mobilize global resources to attack a Hollywood actor within hours, but it takes years to research treatments that could save lives. That tells you everything about where the priorities are." Gibson's own family later revealed that he had received several calls from studio executives concerned about his well-being and suggesting he seek professional help to process the trauma of losing his house in the fires. The irony wasn't lost on Gibson. "Funny how no one worried about my well-being when I was fighting alcoholism for years. But the moment I talk about alternative cancer treatments, everyone becomes a mental health expert." But perhaps the most significant development was the response from ordinary people. Instead of distancing themselves from Gibson due to the controversy, millions of people began seeking more information about the treatments he mentioned. Cancer patient support groups reported a massive increase in questions about ivermectin and fenbendazole. Veterinarians began reporting that people were asking about how to obtain these medications for their pets. The most powerful reaction came from families who had lost loved ones to cancer after rigorously following conventional medical protocols. Thousands of people shared stories about how their doctors refused to consider or discuss any treatment outside standard protocols, even when these protocols clearly weren't working. "My father died following exactly what the oncologists ordered," wrote a woman in a viral post. "Now discovering there were other options they didn't even mention. It's devastating." An investigative journalist who preferred to remain anonymous revealed in a phone interview that he had received clear guidance from his editor to find angles that discredit Gibson's general credibility, not just his medical statements. When pressed about the source of these guidelines, the journalist refused to elaborate, but confirmed that the instructions came from much higher up the food chain than normal for a celebrity story. Gibson, demonstrating the same courage he had exhibited in the original interview, decided not to back down. Instead of issuing apologies or clarifications, he doubled down. During an appearance at MegaCon in Florida, when questioned about the controversy, he responded, "If saving lives is controversial, then I accept being controversial. If questioning medical monopolies is dangerous, then I accept being dangerous. What I don't accept is staying silent while people die from lack of information." Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire situation was how it exposed the fragility of the narrative control system. The coordinated attempt to silence and discredit Gibson ended up amplifying his message in ways he never could have achieved alone. Every article attacking him, every fact check, every censorship attempt only drew more attention to the issues he had raised. What really frightened the institutions wasn't just what Mel Gibson said, but how he said it. There was no hysteria, no wild conspiracy theory, no inflammatory rhetoric. It was simply a man telling a story about 3 friends who were dying and are now alive. The terrible simplicity of that narrative made it impossible to dismiss using the usual discrediting tactics. How do you attack the credibility of someone who is simply reporting what he saw with his own eyes? The answer came in the form of a sophisticated campaign to contextualize not just Gibson's words, but his entire person. Articles began appearing exploring his long history of controversial statements, as if his past opinions automatically invalidated his present observations. Psychologists were consulted to speculate about his mental state after losing his home. Communication experts analyzed his body language, looking for signs of emotional instability. But Gibson had been through something most people never experience. He had lost everything once before and discovered he could still survive. His Malibu home burning while he was in Joe Rogan's studio wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a final liberation from any remaining attachment to material things that could be used to control him. When you've already lost your reputation, your career, your house, and you're still standing, he said in a private conversation that later leaked, you realize there was much less to lose than you thought. The decisive moment came when a group of families whose loved ones had died from cancer organized a press conference to publicly support Gibson. They weren't celebrities or public figures. They were ordinary people who had lost mothers, fathers, children, and spouses by rigorously following conventional medical protocols. Their stories were devastating in their simplicity. Oncologists who refused to discuss any treatment outside official guidelines, even when those treatments clearly weren't working. The media tried to ignore the press conference, but clips spread virally through social media. The contrast was undeniable. On one side, experts in studios talking about dangerous misinformation. On the other, devastated families asking why their loved ones didn't have access to information that could have saved their lives. The official narrative began to crumble under the weight of real human stories. Gibson, realizing he had touched something much bigger than cancer treatments, decided to go even deeper. In a subsequent interview, he began talking about what he had observed during decades in Hollywood, a control system that operated through blackmail, compromise, and fear. The same mechanism that prevents open discussions about medical treatments is the same one that controls what stories Hollywood tells and which voices are allowed, he said. It's all about keeping people dependent on institutions that profit from that dependence. The revelations became even more explosive when Gibson mentioned conversations he had had with other actors over the years. People who had been silenced after questioning official narratives about health, politics, or morality. There are many more of us than you think, he said cryptically. The difference is that most still have something to lose. I don't. This statement caused panic in Hollywood's power circles. Studio executives began making frantic calls trying to discover which other actors might be prepared to speak out. Agents were instructed to check the temperature of their clients regarding controversial issues. Contracts began including stricter clauses about public statements that could harm the studio's image. But the movement had already gained its own momentum. Other actors began making subtle statements supporting Gibson's right to express his opinions. Some shared their own stories about pressure to conform to approved narratives. A well-known action actor, speaking under condition of anonymity, revealed, "We all know which topics are taboo. We all have stories about friends or family members who questioned official medical treatments. Mel just had the courage to say out loud what many of us think privately. The most disturbing aspect of the entire situation was how it revealed the extent of the control system. It wasn't just about medicine or Hollywood. It was about any area where questioning official wisdom could threaten powerful financial interests. Gibson had stumbled upon something many suspected, but few dared articulate: a coordinated mechanism to suppress information that could free people from profitable dependencies. The system had made a fatal miscalculation. By trying to destroy the messenger, they had only amplified the message. And now that message was spreading far beyond anything they could control. The true devastation of the control system came when Gibson decided to use his newfound platform to connect the dots between different areas of information suppression. It was no longer just about cancer treatments. It was about free energy, about healing technologies that existed but were buried, about scientific discoveries that threatened established monopolies. When you start researching one area where truth has been suppressed, Gibson said in a non-televised interview that circulated underground, you discover the same pattern repeats everywhere. The moment that really broke the system was when Gibson began revealing specific conversations he had had with powerful people throughout his career. Without naming names, but with enough details for those involved to know exactly what he was talking about, Gibson described a system where critical information was shared only among elites, while the public received sanitized or completely false versions. They know about cures, Gibson said during a surprise appearance on a small Christian podcast. They know about technologies that could revolutionize energy, health, agriculture. But those technologies would threaten entire systems of control and profit. So they're bought, buried, or their inventors are discredited and silenced. The terrible simplicity of the statement echoed through the alternative media world like an earthquake. What made his revelations particularly devastating was that he wasn't making wild claims about reptilians or elaborate theories. It was about simple, recognizable power dynamics, how money and control operate to keep populations dependent and misinformed. Anyone who had worked in a large corporation or institution could recognize the patterns he described. The reaction was immediate and coordinated. Articles appeared simultaneously in dozens of publications, labeling Gibson as a dangerous conspiracist. Mental health experts were brought in to speculate about his mental decline. His words were taken out of context and mixed with truly absurd theories to create a narrative of insanity by association. But Gibson had learned something crucial during his decades of persecution. The more ferocious the attack, the more likely the information being attacked is true. If I were crazy and saying irrelevant things, he observed, they would ignore me. The fact that they mobilize global resources to attack me tells me I touched something they really don't want discussed. The turning point came when others began speaking out. First, it was retired scientists who no longer had careers to protect. Then came doctors who had lost their licenses for questioning official protocols. Finally came inventors and researchers whose discoveries had been bought and buried by large corporations. Gibson's courage created a domino effect. Each person who spoke out encouraged another to share their story. Within weeks, there was a growing movement of whistleblowers across multiple industries, all telling variations of the same story. Important discoveries being suppressed to protect established interests. The most shocking aspect was discovering how coordinated the suppression system was. It wasn't an elaborate conspiracy with secret meetings. It was simply how the financial system naturally operated. Any innovation that threatened existing profits was systematically discredited, bought, or buried. The free market had become a controlled market where only innovations approved by established interests were allowed. Gibson's transformation from controversial actor to symbol of resistance against information suppression was complete. But more importantly, he had achieved something few in recent history had accomplished, breaking the code of silence that kept vital truths away from the public. And once that code was broken, it became impossible to restore. The system that had tried to silence him now faced something much worse than a rebellious actor. It faced a growing movement of ordinary people who had decided that some truths were too important to be buried, regardless of personal consequences. What happened in the following months transcended anything Mel Gibson could have imagined when he first mentioned his 3 friends cured of cancer. His courage had unleashed something that control systems feared most, a massive spiritual awakening that connected the suppression of medical truth with a much larger battle between light and darkness. People weren't just questioning cancer treatments, they were questioning the very nature of the reality that had been sold to them for decades. The spiritual dimension of the battle became impossible to ignore when reports began emerging of inexplicable healings happening to people who had watched Gibson's interviews. It wasn't just the alternative treatments he mentioned, but cases of spontaneous remission that doctors couldn't explain. As if the very act of breaking the fear around discussions of healing had released something more powerful than any medicine. Maria Santos, a retired nurse from São Paulo, reported an experience that went viral among Christian communities. After watching Mel Gibson talk about his friend's courage, I started praying differently. No longer asking God to accept the doctor's will, but asking him to reveal his own will for healing. Within 3 weeks, the tumors in my liver simply disappeared. My oncologist called it inexplicable spontaneous remission. Stories like Maria's multiplied by the thousands. People who had resignedly accepted their diagnoses began seeking not just alternative treatments, but also healing through faith with renewed intensity. Churches reported massive increases in seeking healing prayer. Bible study groups formed specifically to explore Christ's promises about divine healing that many had forgotten or rationalized away. But the deepest aspect of the transformation was how it connected people with their own personal mission. Gibson, by demonstrating that an ordinary man could face powerful systems and survive, had shown that each person had a unique role in revealing truth. Millions began asking, if Mel Gibson can risk everything to share a truth about healing, what truth should I be sharing? The parallels with the crucifixion became inescapable. Just as Christ was attacked by the religious and political authorities of his time for challenging established systems of control, Gibson was facing the coordinated wrath of modern institutions for threatening profitable monopolies. And just as the crucifixion paradoxically spread Christ's message instead of silencing it, the attacks on Gibson only amplified his influence. The spiritual connection deepened when Gibson began speaking openly about how his experience on the set of The Passion of the Christ had prepared him for this moment. When I played Jesus being attacked by the authorities, he said in a private meeting that was later recorded and leaked, I didn't fully understand. I was rehearsing for my own life. The same spiritual forces that crucified Christ still operate today, just through different institutions. This revelation resonated deeply with Christians around the world, who had long felt that something was profoundly wrong with systems that promised healing but kept people sick, that promised information but spread misinformation, that promised freedom but created dependence. Gibson's courage had articulated something many felt but couldn't express, that the battle for bodies was also a battle for souls. Christian communities began organizing fasts and prayer vigils, not just for Gibson, but for what he represented, the courage to speak truth to established power. Verses like Ephesians 6:12 gained new meaning. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. The impact extended beyond Christian communities. People from different spiritual traditions recognized that the battle Gibson had highlighted transcended denominations. It was about the fundamental freedom to seek truth and healing through whatever means God chose to reveal, without being limited by human systems that prioritized profit over life. Gibson's personal transformation also became a powerful testimony. This was the same man who had struggled with alcoholism, who had made offensive statements in the past, who had been rejected by Hollywood. His journey of fall and spiritual redemption offered hope for anyone who felt their own past mistakes disqualified them from being used by God for important purposes. God doesn't call the qualified, Gibson said in one of his most impactful statements. He qualifies the called. If he can use a broken man like me to awaken people to truths about healing, he can use anyone who is willing to pay the price of obedience. The movement that had begun with a simple mention of 3 friends cured of cancer had become something that the participants themselves recognized as much larger than any human effort. It was as if the Holy Spirit was using one man's courage to catalyze an awakening that had been prophesied for decades by Christian leaders who foresaw that the last days would be marked by a massive revelation of hidden truths. And at the center of it all was the question that Gibson had posed through his actions, and that now echoed in millions of hearts. If you knew a truth that could save lives, but sharing it would cost everything you have, would you have the courage to speak? The answer of an entire generation was being written in real time, one brave soul at a time. The story of Mel Gibson silencing a reporter live and unleashing a global spiritual awakening touched something much deeper than any Hollywood controversy could explain. What we witnessed was the manifestation of an eternal principle. When someone is willing to lose everything for a truth, that truth becomes unstoppable. Gibson wasn't just defending alternative cancer treatments. He was embodying the very essence of Christian sacrifice, where the willingness to suffer for others releases supernatural power. The parallels with Christ's passion became undeniable when later analysis revealed that Gibson had lost practically everything material. During the same period, he gained his most powerful prophetic voice. His house burned, contracts were cancelled, Hollywood friends abandoned him, but each loss only strengthened his moral authority to speak truths that others didn't dare pronounce. It was as if he was going through his own public crucifixion to gain the right to resurrect with a message that no earthly power could silence. The prophetic dimension of the moment became clear when Christian leaders began connecting Gibson's courage with biblical prophecies about the end times. The book of Daniel speaks of times when those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Gibson, unknowingly, had become a living fulfillment of that prophecy, using his platform not for personal gain, but to teach multitudes about truths that could literally save lives. The most powerful aspect of the entire experience was how it demonstrated that God still operates through imperfect people to fulfill perfect purposes. Gibson never claimed to be a prophet or spiritual leader. He was simply a broken man who had found the freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose except his own soul. And that freedom had transformed him into the most dangerous possible person for systems based on fear and control. Someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or silenced. The ramifications of his courage continued expanding in ways that defy any purely human explanation. Doctors who had remained silent for decades about effective alternative treatments began finding courage to speak. Researchers who had hidden discoveries for fear of professional persecution began publishing their findings. Patients who had resignedly accepted terminal diagnoses began seeking healing with renewed faith that produced results conventional medicine couldn't explain. The events we witnessed are only the beginning of what's to come in the final battle between truth and lies, between divine healing and corrupt human systems. To be spiritually prepared for the approaching times, our prophetic preparation guide is essential. Last units available in the pinned comment. Don't wait any longer to understand your role in this spiritual war. The lasting legacy of the moment when Mel Gibson silenced a reporter wasn't just about alternative medicine or freedom of speech. It was about the transformative power of truth, spoken without fear of consequences. In an era where lies had become official policy and truth was labeled as hate speech, Gibson demonstrated that one person aligned with eternal principles can be more powerful than entire institutions based on false foundations. His transformation from controversial actor to reluctant prophet offered hope for anyone who felt disqualified by past failures. If God could use a man who had struggled with alcoholism, who had made offensive statements, who had been rejected by his peers, then there was no one beyond the possibility of redemption and divine purpose. The message was clear. God doesn't need perfect people. He needs available people. The deepest lesson from the entire experience was articulated by Gibson in his own words. When you stop trying to protect your reputation and start protecting your soul, you discover you had much less to lose and much more to gain than you ever imagined. That spiritual freedom, born from the willingness to suffer for others, had become the most disruptive force that Hollywood and its allied institutions had ever faced. The verses that best capture the moment came from John 15:18-20. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If these revelations awakened something in your spirit about your own calling to speak truths in your sphere of influence, show it by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing in the comments how God has used imperfect people for perfect purposes in your own life. Your testimony might touch the heart of someone who needs courage to take the next step in their own journey of obedience. Join our community of truth seekers who understand that the end times require supernatural courage to face systems that prefer profit over life, lies over truth, and control over spiritual freedom. The question that Mel Gibson had posed through his actions echoed in every heart. When your turn comes to choose between personal safety and saving truth, what will your response be? Until the next video,